Hey, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on this webinar focused on preventing traffic overload on your websites. We're going to be focusing on a virtual waiting room approach. I know a few of you are still logging on, but before we get started, I'd just like to do some very quick introductions. My name's Tom. I head up product sales here at Technica. Been here for quite some time now. I'll give you a very quick summary of who we are just in a minute, but I'd like to also introduce my colleague Chris, who's with me today.
Good morning or good afternoon.
Chris is our head of technical pre-sales, so he works on a very technical level with a lot of our businesses that we work with and customers, helping them to protect their websites. Before we get started, we will be doing a Q&A at the end of today's webinar. If anyone does have any questions at any point, please do type them into the question box on the side of the webinar, and we will be answering those questions at the end. So any questions anyone has, please do send them over to us. We're looking forward to answering those at the end of the webinar. So yes, please feel free to type those into the question bar. In terms of what we're going to cover, I've got some research we as a business have done on the industry as a whole, just to sort of show a little bit more information on the problem space that we see and how it's affecting businesses. We're going to talk very quickly about the impact this is having for people and the impact it has on customer experience. We're going to touch a little bit on advice on how we see businesses should be prepared. Then I'm going to pass over to Chris. Chris is going to focus on the various solutions in the market that are out there for everyone on today's webinar, and those solutions and how to handle sort of spikes in traffic. Chris will then pass back to me, where I'll do a very short bit about how our virtual waiting room works and can help before we go to that Q&A. So thanks everyone for joining us, and without further ado, I'll get started. So just in terms of a very quick background on who we are and you know why we're speaking about this subject. Technica as a business was founded over 10 years ago now. It was founded by our CTO and CEO, who are still in the business, and they originally built and ran the Glastonbury ticketing engine, Glastonbury being one of the largest festivals here in Europe and around the world. They ran that, it was getting on for over 10 years ago, very successfully. And for 1 year, there was a major push in ticket sales online. And what happened was that website fell down. They weren't given any notice. A massive spike in traffic was followed by a 52-hour-long outage, taking down a telephone exchange, and people deciding to print error messages onto t-shirts and sell them at the festival. So very public, very big example of an outage there that our co-founders many, many years ago. But what they were able to do was take the learnings from that, re-architect the system so that it then sold out in record time the following year, and founded Technica, which has since spent the past 10 years working with businesses helping to make their systems more performant, more scalable, and 100% available. In terms of the problem space we're going to be talking about today and why we feel that there's absolutely a need for a virtual waiting room in a lot of businesses. We are in 2018, but we did a piece of research over the past few years, and in 1 year alone, we spotted over 1,500 outages on websites around the world. Those outages weren't tied for a single sector, they weren't tied to a single month. There was a spread of outages around the whole year across sectors. So although there's a lot of cloud architecture and infrastructure out there, as a whole industry are getting much better at preparing for events and managing traffic. Outages are still commonplace in today's society and still something we see a lot of. What's also really interesting about those outages, in terms of the industries that suffered the most that we've seen from our analysis, retail was first, travel and tourism was second, with ticketing coming in third, media, and then financial services, and comms coming after that, followed by a long tail of other industries. Important to note that these were only the outages that we could find, and we're very certain that there was many more that were also ongoing. In terms of just those outages and how important they were, You can see here the large orange bar represents medium and blue severe. When we're classifying an outage as severe, what we're saying there is it was a site that was down for a long proportion of time, completely unable to function. Medium would mean that it was on and off, and minor would mean it was showing a couple of errors. So certainly a lot of severe outages across the sort of sector, and also a lot of medium outages, a lot of outages that would be very disruptive to businesses. I think this is all just generally common knowledge, by the way, but it's just something I want to do to set the scene. Reasons for these outages as we saw them: TV programs, peak sale events, major incidents, things like Black Friday. Some things that people maybe don't think about. It could just be the general rise in traffic year on year for businesses on legacy platforms. It could be celeb endorsements, planned or unplanned. It could be flash sales. It could be seasonal periods. This sounds very retail, but we see seasonal periods affect other businesses, such as people processing tax returns, exam boards, universities, colleges. In terms of other factors that can affect people, maybe not so well known, but we have seen a lot of businesses suffer from geographical factors. So this could be weather, damaging flights. It could be all manner of things, as well as financial crises, world events, general things like elections happening, can really cause some spikes in traffic for a lot of websites that are just completely unplanned or unprepared for. And then obvious things like product launches, recalls, and marketing campaigns. Just to touch on the impact of this, though, we did some analysis on some retailers here in the UK. We concluded that on average, an hour of downtime would cost an average retailer here over £57,000 in lost revenue, with the downtime for a day costing over £1.3 million to the average business. So, certainly a costly impact to the business in terms of bottom line. We also did what I think is less obvious is the impact of slowdowns. And so we did a piece of research with one of the largest retailers in Europe, looking at their go slows, looked at their average basket size, their conversion rate, and the impact that's impacted when the site runs slow. And over 13 peaks over 1 year, what we looked at is if we were to prevent those go slows, we could generate an extra £3.36 million worth of revenue for that business. So certainly a lot of money there. Of course, there will be people here that aren't in e-commerce, that aren't in retail, but are in other sectors. But it's important to notice that 79% of customers are unlikely to buy or come back to your site if they experience performance problems. In general, the public expects a website to load in under 4 seconds on mobile, and 7% of people said that if they've been on a site that was 1 second slower than previous, it may impact their decision to actually progress with that journey. So, we'll know it. Their websites still go down. We still see a lot of outages, and this is still a problem for a lot of businesses, and it can cause a lot of pain to both the business and the customers. In terms of how you should get ready for this, Chris is going to talk about solutions, but we would certainly say you should know your events, understanding what's going to go on, have a plan for what's going to happen, know when it's going to happen. Of course, some stuff will catch you out. Understanding your limits, good performance testing, benchmarking, baselining, knowing what you can handle, having a plan for if that gets blown out of the water, and being prepared for what could happen if something was bigger than expected or came out of the blue are certainly things that we should be doing. I'm now going to pass over to Chris. Chris is going to talk just a little bit about the solutions you have in terms of managing this currently out there in the market as we see them.
Thank you very much, Tom. So obviously we're not a solution out on the market, and what I wanted to highlight with everyone today was just some of the solutions that we've actually seen other customers, or we've seen other customers implement in order for them to attempt to try and address this challenge. So first and foremost would be over provisioning. So this could be that you've got one or multiple data centers where you're actually hosting your web-based application, but you're running it at, say, 25% utilization in order for you to be able to meet the rise in traffic. Now, this can be quite a costly way of being able to deal with this potential spike in traffic, especially if the spikes in traffic occur quite regularly. Also, it could also be that you just do not have the cash or the capital in order for you to be able to build a data center or to be able to build an application whereby you can allow for that level of utilization to meet the demand in traffic. The next one is auto-scaling. So we absolutely believe that auto-scaling is something that businesses should be using, especially when it comes to their applications. However, the issues arise with auto-scaling when you can't scale to meet the demand. So, for example, we've seen spikes in traffic that happen within tens of seconds, and auto-scaling in some instances won't take effect until at least 3 to 5 minutes after that's actually happened. So you're then getting a processing bottleneck. And the other issue with auto-scaling may not actually be to do with the application itself. It could be to do with affiliates or third parties that you utilize. So in some instances, the application reacts perfectly fine to the auto-scaling, but then you're relying on a payment gateway that's provided by a third party, and that then causes a processing bottleneck. The third way is obviously re-architecting the environment. So having a look at the entire application, every element of the service that's built up, and then redesigning it. And while that may sometimes solve the problem, it could also introduce other problems that weren't foreseen into the actual architecture itself. And so that presents other potential issues. We've then also got using JavaScript as a way of you being able to implement a virtual waiting room of some description. And we have seen this work. However, we've spoken to some customers that have done this before, and they found that they don't like the fact that there's some code that sits on the actual front end, so it means that the traffic is still hitting the actual site itself and causing these big spikes in traffic. Some other customers also don't like the fact that you actually have to redirect the actual customer to a different area of the site, so the URL looks different, so it lacks in customer confidence in the actual site itself. And finally is using holding pages. So a holding page is probably the least favored solution out there, purely and simply because it does absolutely degrade the customer experience when you assume that you're going to get through to order those tickets or that item that you really absolutely needed to get your hands on, to then be presented with a page that doesn't really give you any information as to where you are, if you are in a queue, or to actually give you any explanation as to when you're actually going to be able to make it through the actual site itself. So if I just hand back to Tom now.
Great, thanks for that, Chris. And yeah, just to reiterate what Chris is saying there is certainly we think things like auto-scaling, over-provisioning certainly have a place in re-architecture, and it's about figuring out what is the right solution for your business at the right time. I think what we would say as well is, as Chris mentioned, holding pages are probably the most disruptive and least favorite of the customer, but sadly what we probably see used the most often. So certainly something to be aware of there in those solutions. In terms of the virtual waiting room approach and the real core of this webinar, I just want to talk a little bit about how our technology can be used in tandem with some of the other things you've seen today to make sure that actually your site remains 100% available, no matter what happens in terms of the spike in traffic. The first thing to mention, Traffic Defender is a completely seamless and white label product. It will sit in front of your website and no one ever knows it's there. In fact, we sit in front of a lot of the major retailers here in Europe, and people, you've probably shopped at some point for a Traffic Defender system without even knowing we're there. Traffic Defender is then there to monitor the flow of traffic, and at the point at which you receive more than you can typically handle, where your site would start to slow down, and obviously performance would degrade and would see those losses in revenue, or your site would fall down or struggle completely, that's when we divert users into a fair and transparent queuing solution. So certainly something that's there as an option to make sure that no matter what happens, you have complete protection. In terms of an implementation, Traffic Defender typically sits behind your CDN or WAF-based layer, but in front of all of that infrastructure. So as Chris was saying, no matter how big the spike is, we can control what's actually going to hit your server and give you complete protection. Of course, everyone will say, is there some latency there? Typical latency time in an implementation is between 1 and 2 milliseconds, but we always recommend people test that out. In terms of how the system works, we mentioned sort of knowing what's happening and knowing your bottlenecks, where they are and what they look like. Traffic Defender, because of where it sits, has the ability to break your site out into a number of areas. We call these pools. So you could have a queue on a specific product page if there's a launch going on to ensure that that page is protected and the rest of your customers can shop as normal. You could have a queue on a specific bottleneck, let's say a payment provider. So Traffic Defender effectively gives you the ability to not only manage all of your traffic, but also control traffic in certain areas of your site where you may have particular problems or challenges. In terms of what we do then, at the point at which your site is starting to slow down or indeed fall over, this is when we'll put our users into a fair and transparent queuing solution. Because of where we sit, we haven't yet today had anyone who has been able to bypass or skip this queuing solution. And what we do in that page, it's completely white label, completely part of your website and the user journey, is we give you a HTML template which you can populate however you see fit. We give you the option to display to that user a position in the queue, an estimated time to entry, or a progress bar, or a combination of the above, so that you can communicate with your users and ensure that your site is as full and maximizing capacity as much as possible. It's also important to note that during this period, the user is never diverted away from the site. So the user and the URL will always remain as yours, always remain as the same, so that people never feel like they've had to leave. In terms of the solution itself, we've been operating for over 3 years now. We've implemented with most of the major sort of commerce platforms that are out there, and have implementations running with most of the major CDNs out there, and indeed some partnerships in place as well. In terms of course, one of the key bits is we're adding another layer in of infrastructure in here. Is there additional risk? We'd be wrong to say there wasn't, but in terms of how we manage that, all of our customers get dedicated infrastructure. That infrastructure is hosted in multiple availability zones. So for us to have an issue, we have to have an issue in 2 places at the same time. If we host a 100% available DNS-based switch, which means you can bring the solution on and off instantaneously as well. Touch wood, we've delivered 100% availability because of this approach to date. So it's not something anyone's needed, but you can bring our solution in and out of line within a minute. In terms of the scale and what we're able to handle, because we are talking about peaks here today, it's important to mention our minimum customer setup can deal with up to 1 million concurrent users on a site in a queue at any one time. So that's 1 million people as our base implementation. And typically we can deal with around 7,000 concurrent requests a second. That is our base setup, and we can scale the solution both horizontally and vertically to meet any requirement. And of course, we over provision. So certainly in terms of availability and the infrastructure we provide, we haven't yet been faced with a spike that poses too many challenges. We of course back this all up with 24/7 support, proactive alerting and monitoring. We have a team of in-house experts. So what I would say is because we have experts here, customer success managers, we're part of the biggest day in your year potentially, and it's important for us to be there. So we're quite often proactively working with customers to make sure that their events go as seamlessly as possible. As we said, 100% availability for the historically and for the year to date as well. So that's both our service and our portal. In terms of what does this look like in real life, we work with a lot of major retail sites around seasonal periods. We work with a large number of universities and other businesses with legacy infrastructure, helping them to prepare for events. But just to put this into kind of some realistic perspective, one of the businesses we work with getting over a year ago had the #1 app here on the UK iTunes store, and that was a voting app for the TV show The Voice. That app was then tested to be able to handle up to 1 million concurrent users voting at once, and we were there to make sure that actually the app stayed up and everyone voting had a seamless experience. I'm happy to say that was a fantastic event for everyone involved, but in terms of the scale and what we can do with, if you have 1 million concurrent users ready to hit your site concurrently, we're ready to take them and help you with that. So that was a real quick summary of how we help and what we do. I just want to roll into the Q&A. I can see that we already have some questions in the question box. And I'm just looking over those now, so we'll just start to go through those questions. As I said, if anyone does have any questions, please do let us know, and we're going to cover them now. The first question from Ian: what if you're a payment provider? Payment providers are certainly a common bottleneck for a large number of our customers. Sometimes we'll work indirectly, and by indirectly, what I mean by that is we'll be sat in front of the payment provider, queuing and limiting the amount of traffic hitting them. We've done that for a large number of businesses all around the globe. Also, if you wanted to implement some sort of queuing solution for a specific payment service, we are working with a number of people who offer paid and subscription services, and effectively we can build bespoke, custom, either API, mobile app, or website integrations for them, so that your customers, as they're logging onto the payment provider, are then put in a queue just while we load that. So more than used to working with payment providers, certainly something we can protect. We did have another question from Steve. Steve was just asking, from the research that we have done, what was the #1 cause of outages, which I thought was a really kind of prominent question and something I really wanted to dig into. So over the past year of the outages, we have seen the absolute #1 cause of outages was actually major incidents. And so what it wasn't. It was seasonal. So seasonal, what we're talking about there is key events like Black Friday and the 4th of July, major shopping periods, Father's Day, Mother's Day, and all of the above. So certainly seasonality playing a real role in terms of how things are playing out. I think one type of outage that isn't really shown so much here is we have seen a lot of outages that have been caused by error, and that could be error in terms of people. It would appear that they're making releases that have lowered the capacity on the site, but also things like people publishing the wrong price or a controversial post that have driven really sharp and sudden amounts of traffic to that website. So, of course, it's worth bearing in mind that what your capacity is today, it may not be that in the future, and it's got to be something that you have to keep up to date with your release train. So, certainly one thing to look at. Just looking in terms of other questions. Lisa's just asking, what is the best way to prepare for an upcoming event? Did you have any thoughts on that one, Chris? Did you want to take that?
So I think one of the best ways for preparing for an up-and-coming event is obviously understanding, where the traffic is going to potentially be generated on the actual site itself. So say, for example, if you know that you're going to be doing a specific sale of a specific product line, making sure that you understand what the capacity is of that area of the site specifically, and then making sure that you've taken the steps in order for you to protect that in its entirety. That could be that you decide to do some stress testing initially in order for you to get an idea of what the load can be like. And then obviously communicate with companies such as ourselves to say, you know what, we've done some testing and we know that we're not potentially ready to deal with the spikes in traffic, so that we need a helping hand in order for us to deal with that.
Definitely, I think I would echo that. Strong testing is absolutely vital to prepare for any event. I think the other things I would add is when we're testing the site, look at the site as a whole, so not just yourselves, but any third-party provider, back-end solutions you have there, certainly things to consider and look at. So look at the whole thing as a whole. And one thing you could consider is, if you do have a big event coming up, what can you lose? Can you turn off features such as offers, anything that's CPU intensive? Some people will remove search temporarily. What things can you do? How much can you offload to a CDN as you're getting ready for a major event? We do have a couple more questions. Some are probably going to take me a little bit longer to answer. So James and Carl, I'll come back to you just on email after this presentation, just to answer the final few questions. In terms of just closing off, I'd like to thank you all for joining today. It's been great to have you on the webinar. We are offering a trial, so if you do want to try Traffic Defender now, protect your website and guarantee that availability, please do get in touch. We're more than happy to talk about how we can potentially help you with those upcoming events, or just generally ensure that you always stay available. So I'd just like to take a moment just to thank everyone for joining. Enjoy the rest of your day, and for those of us in the UK, have a great long weekend coming up. Thanks everyone.